Robert had been waking up to the same view for 30 years. His small farm sat on one side of a deep ravine, and every morning he'd cross his private bridge to get to the main county road. It wasn't a fancy bridge, just strong wooden planks and steel beams that he'd built himself back in the 90s with help from a local contractor. But it was his, sitting right on his property, and it had served him well all these years. About 15 years ago, a development company bought the land on the other side of his farm. They called it Riverside Estates, which always made Robert chuckle, because there wasn't actually a river anywhere nearby, just that ravine. Within 2 years, they'd built 50 large homes, the kind with 3-car garages and fancy stone facades. The houses sold fast to people moving out from the city, looking for a quiet neighborhood with big yards. Here's the thing, though. When those developers built Riverside Estates, they didn't think too hard about access. Sure, there was an old logging trail that connected to the highway about 6 miles away, but nobody wanted to use that bumpy dirt path every day. Robert's bridge and the private road leading to it provided a straight shot to the county road. Just 5 minutes to town instead of nearly an hour on that awful trail. The first Homeowners Association president, an older guy named Bill, came to talk to Robert shortly after the first families moved in. Bill was straightforward about it. He knew the bridge was Robert's private property, and he wasn't asking for any legal rights to it. He just wanted to know if the residents could use it to get to and from their homes. In exchange, the HOA would chip in for maintenance and repairs. Split it down the middle, keep everything friendly. Robert agreed. Why wouldn't he? He wasn't using the bridge that much himself anymore since he'd semi-retired from farming. And the extra money for maintenance was helpful. Plus, Bill and most of the residents were nice enough people. They'd wave when they drove past, and some even bought vegetables from his farm stand in the summer. It was a good arrangement, the kind that works because everyone's reasonable about it. That went on for almost 13 years without a single problem. The HOA paid their share on time, Robert kept the bridge in good condition, and everyone got where they needed to go. But then Bill retired and moved to Florida to be near his grandkids. That's when things started to change. The new HOA president was a guy named Derek. He'd moved to Riverside Estates just 2 years earlier. One of those corporate types who treated everything like a business negotiation. 3 months after becoming president, Derek showed up at Robert's door with a folder full of papers and a lawyer standing behind him. Derek didn't waste time with small talk. He said the current arrangement was unprofessional and risky for the HOA. What if Robert decided one day to block access? What if he wanted to charge them more money? Derek wanted a formal legal easement, a permanent right for the HOA to use the bridge and road. He'd had his lawyer draw up the papers already. All Robert needed to do was sign. Robert read through the documents while Derek stood there tapping his foot. The easement would give Riverside Estates permanent access rights, which meant Robert couldn't ever restrict their use of his property. It would also lower his property value significantly because future buyers wouldn't want land with an easement running through it, and Derek was offering exactly $0 for this permanent right. Robert handed the papers back and said no. He told Derek the current arrangement worked just fine, and had worked fine for over a decade. If Derek wanted to put something in writing about the maintenance cost sharing, that was okay. But Robert wasn't giving away permanent rights to his property for nothing. Derek's face turned red. He said Robert was being unreasonable, that he was trying to hold the entire neighborhood hostage. The lawyer with him started talking about good faith negotiations and community responsibility. Robert just shook his head and closed the door. Over the next few weeks, Derek kept pushing. He sent letters, made phone calls, even showed up unannounced twice more. Each time, Robert gave the same answer. The bridge was his property. The arrangement they had was working, and he wasn't signing any easement. Then Derek started getting nasty about it. He sent a formal letter from his lawyer, claiming that Robert was attempting to extort the neighborhood. He suggested that the bridge might not even be entirely on Robert's property, and that they'd be investigating the property lines. He told other residents that Robert was planning to block their access and charge them thousands of dollars. None of it was true, but Derek was spreading the rumors anyway. Robert tried to ignore it. He'd lived in this area his whole life, and he knew most people would see through Derek's nonsense. But it did sting to have a few neighbors who'd been friendly for years, suddenly giving him cold looks when they drove past. Then came the morning that changed everything. Robert woke up around 6:30, Same as always. He made coffee and went out to the porch to watch the sunrise. That's when he noticed something was wrong. The usual sound of cars crossing his bridge was missing. Actually, everything was too quiet. He walked down his driveway toward where the bridge should be. As he got closer, his stomach dropped. The bridge was gone. Not damaged, not broken, gone. Completely demolished. All that remained were torn-up concrete footings and broken wood scattered across both sides of the ravine. Tire tracks from heavy equipment marked up the ground around the site. Robert stood there staring at 30 years of his work reduced to rubble. His hands were shaking. This wasn't an accident. Someone had brought in serious machinery to do this, probably in the middle of the night when he wouldn't hear it over the ravine. His phone started ringing. It was Derek. The HOA president's voice was smug, almost cheerful. He said he'd had the bridge demolished because it was a safety hazard. An engineer had looked at it and declared it unsafe, so Derek had acted quickly to protect the community. He'd hired a contractor to do the work properly, and they'd be building a new, better bridge. A modern one that met all current codes, and since it would be on what Derek claimed was shared property, they'd be sending Robert a bill for his portion of the work. Robert could barely speak. He asked Derek if he'd just admitted to destroying private property in the middle of the night. Derek laughed and said Robert should check his property lines. The bridge was partially on HOA land, or at least that's what their survey suggested. Either way, it was done now, and Robert should just accept that they'd be building something better for everyone. Robert hung up and immediately called his lawyer. Then he called the county sheriff. While he waited for them to arrive, he walked the property line himself. Every marker was right where it had always been. The bridge had been entirely on his land, just like the deed said. Derek hadn't just made a mistake. He'd deliberately destroyed Robert's property based on a lie. But as Robert stood there looking at the destroyed bridge, something else occurred to him. Something Derek apparently hadn't thought about. That bridge wasn't just Robert's way to get to the county road. It was the only way for anyone to reach Riverside Estates without using that terrible logging trail. And the road leading to the bridge, the paved private road that provided actual access to the bridge site, that was Robert's property too. Derek had just demolished the bridge, thinking he could force Robert's hand and build a new one on his own terms. What he didn't realize was that without that bridge, the road leading to it didn't go anywhere useful, and Robert had no obligation to let anyone use his private road to access a ravine with no bridge. Derek had just cut off access to his entire neighborhood, and he didn't even know it yet. The first person to discover the problem wasn't Derek. It was a guy named Tom who lived 3 houses into Riverside Estates and worked the early shift at the hospital. He left his house at 5:45 that morning, same as always, expecting to cross the bridge and be at work by 6:15. Instead, he found himself sitting in his car, staring at a pile of rubble where the bridge used to be. He tried calling Derek, but it went to voicemail. So Tom did what he had to do. He turned around, drove through the neighborhood to the back exit, and took the old logging trail. He was an hour and 20 minutes late to work. By 7 in the morning, Robert's phone was ringing off the hook. Angry residents wanted to know why his bridge was gone and when it would be fixed. Robert calmly explained to each caller that he didn't destroy the bridge. The HOA president did, and until it was rebuilt, there was no bridge to cross, which meant he couldn't allow anyone to use his private road, since it didn't lead anywhere anymore. Most people didn't understand at first. One woman insisted that Robert had to let them through because they'd been using that road for years. Robert explained that they'd been using it to cross his bridge. Without the bridge, the road just led to a dead end at a ravine. What would be the point? That's when it started to sink in for people. A few of the residents drove down to see for themselves, and that's when they really understood. The road did belong to Robert. The entire paved stretch from the county road to where the bridge used to be was on his property. And legally speaking, he had every right to block access to a road that no longer went anywhere. By 9 o'clock, there were 15 cars backed up on that logging trail. It hadn't been maintained in years, and when 2 cars tried to pass each other on a narrow section, one slid partially into a ditch. A tow truck had to come pull it out, blocking the trail for another 40 minutes. Parents were late getting their kids to school. People were missing work meetings. One woman's tire got punctured by a sharp rock on the trail and she didn't have a spare. The complaints started flooding into the HOA email and Derek's personal phone. Derek initially tried to spin the situation. He sent out a mass email to all residents explaining that he'd made an executive decision to remove the dangerous old bridge and that a new, safer one would be constructed within a few weeks. In the meantime, residents should use the back trail and plan for extra commute time. He made it sound like a minor inconvenience for the greater good, but people weren't buying it. A retired lawyer named Patricia, who lived in the neighborhood, started asking questions in the community Facebook group. Had Derek gotten proper approval from the board for this? Had he consulted with a real engineer? And most importantly, did he have permission from the property owner to demolish the bridge? Derek responded that he'd acted in the best interest of the community and that Robert was being unreasonable about rebuilding. He suggested that Robert was trying to exploit the situation for money. Patricia didn't accept that answer. She did some digging and found out that the bridge had been entirely on Robert's property, according to county records. She also discovered that Derek had spent over $30,000 in HOA funds to hire the demolition contractor, and he'd done it without a vote or even informing the rest of the board. Then Patricia drove out to meet Robert herself. She arrived at his farm in the early afternoon, and Robert could tell right away she was different from Derek. She apologized first, saying she was sorry about the bridge and sorry that Derek had created this mess. She asked if they could talk about what happened. Robert made her a cup of coffee and they sat on his porch while he explained the whole situation. The years of the working arrangement with the previous HOA, Derek's demands for a permanent easement, the threats and accusations, and then waking up to find his bridge destroyed. Patricia listened without interrupting. When Robert finished, she said something that surprised him. She told him she didn't blame him one bit for being angry, and if she were in his position, she'd probably feel the same way. She also said that Derek had overstepped badly, and that she'd be calling for an emergency board meeting to address it. But Patricia also asked Robert what it would take to make things right. Not for Derek, but for the 50 families who were now stuck driving an hour out of their way because one person had made a stupid decision. Robert had been thinking about this since the morning. He told Patricia his terms. The HOA needed to pay for a complete rebuild of his bridge, exactly the way it was before, using quality materials. They also needed to cover his legal fees for dealing with this situation, and he wanted a written apology from the board acknowledging that Derek had destroyed his private property without permission. In exchange, Robert would allow immediate access to his road during the construction so contractors could work on the bridge. Once it was rebuilt, they could go back to the old arrangement where the HOA contributed to maintenance costs, but Robert would keep full ownership and control. No easement, no permanent rights, no legal claims on his property. Patricia said that sounded fair to her. She asked how much the rebuild would cost. Robert had already gotten an estimate that morning from the same contractor who'd built the original bridge. $150,000 for materials and labor. Patricia didn't flinch. She said she'd take it to the board and to the community. Meanwhile, the situation in Riverside Estates was getting worse by the day. The logging trail became a muddy disaster after a rainstorm that night. 3 cars got stuck and a local farmer with a tractor had to pull them out. He charged $50 per car and people paid it because they had no choice. The commute was destroying people's schedules. One man who worked downtown and had a tight schedule ended up quitting his job because he couldn't reliably get there on time anymore. A woman who ran a home daycare started losing clients because parents couldn't drop off their kids early enough on the new route. Then there was the safety issue. The logging trail wasn't built for daily traffic. There were no streetlights, the turns were sharp, and in some places there wasn't even a guardrail. Someone was going to get hurt eventually. Property values started dropping almost immediately. 2 families put their houses up for sale within the first week, both listing them below market value just to get out. Real estate agents were telling potential buyers that the access situation was temporary, but word was spreading fast. Nobody wanted to pay $500,000 for a house they couldn't easily get to. Derek called another HOA meeting to address the growing anger. About 40 residents showed up, and Robert heard later that it didn't go well for Derek. People demanded to know why he'd demolished a bridge without permission, why he'd spent HOA funds without approval, and why he hadn't thought about how they'd actually get to their homes. Derek tried to defend himself by claiming Robert had been planning to block their access anyway and that he'd acted preemptively to protect the neighborhood. Someone asked if he had any proof of that. Derek didn't. Then someone asked about the property lines. Derek admitted that the bridge had been on Robert's property, but insisted that Robert should share responsibility for rebuilding it, since the neighborhood depended on it. Patricia stood up and asked Derek a simple question. If the bridge was on Robert's private property, and Derek had demolished it without permission, wasn't that destruction of private property? Possibly even criminal, Derek stuttered through an answer about good faith and community benefit. Patricia cut him off and said she'd be calling for a vote of no confidence in his leadership. 12 other residents stood up to second it. Back at his farm, Robert was getting mixed reactions from the community. Some people understood that he was the victim here and that Derek had caused the problem, but others were angry at him for not just letting everyone use his road anyway. Bridge or no bridge. They didn't seem to grasp that a road to nowhere wasn't useful to anyone. One evening, a carload of younger residents showed up at Robert's property. They weren't threatening exactly, but they were insistent. They needed access. They had jobs and families. Couldn't Robert just let them through during construction? Robert explained again that there was no bridge to construct yet, because the HOA hadn't agreed to his terms. And even if there was construction, his road couldn't handle 50 families worth of traffic going back and forth every day. It was a private farm road, not a highway. One of the young men said that Robert was punishing innocent people for what Derek did. Robert replied that Derek had punished innocent people, including Robert himself, and now everyone had to deal with the consequences. He wasn't the one who demolished a bridge in the middle of the night. They left, but Robert could see the frustration in their faces. He understood it. These people hadn't done anything wrong. Most of them probably didn't even know about Derek's confrontations with Robert before the bridge came down, but understanding their frustration didn't change the facts of the situation. 3 weeks after the demolition, Patricia called Robert with news. The HOA board had voted to remove Derek as president. It took some political maneuvering and a special election, but they'd done it. Patricia was now the president, and she had full board authorization to negotiate with Robert. She asked if his terms were still the same. Robert said they were. Patricia said she'd have a contract. The 4th week after the bridge demolition started with a crisis that nobody had predicted. A woman in Riverside Estates went into early labor at 2 a.m. Her husband called for an ambulance, but when the dispatcher asked for their address and the driver looked at the route, there was a problem. The logging trail. In the dark, with a pregnant woman in active labor, the ambulance did come, but it took them 45 minutes instead of the usual 12. They had to drive slowly on that bumpy, poorly lit trail, trying not to jostle their patient too much. The baby was born in the ambulance 10 minutes before they reached the hospital. Mother and baby turned out fine, but it was closer than anyone wanted. That incident changed the tone of everything. This wasn't just about inconvenience anymore, or property values, or who was right and who was wrong. This was about safety. What if it had been a heart attack? What if someone had been in a serious car accident? The logging trail wasn't just slow. In an emergency, it could be deadly. Patricia used that incident to finally push through the approval she needed. She called a mandatory HOA meeting and didn't mince words. She told everyone that Derek's decision to destroy Robert's bridge had put the entire community at risk. She explained Robert's terms again, clearly and simply. $150,000 for the bridge rebuild, $25,000 for Robert's legal fees and a written apology. In return, they'd get their access back and could continue the arrangement that had worked fine for 13 years. Someone in the back asked why they should pay Robert's legal fees when he hadn't even sued them yet. Patricia explained that Robert had every right to sue for damages far beyond the bridge cost. The fact that he was willing to settle for just having his bridge replaced and his legal bills covered was actually generous. If they fought this in court, they could end up paying 3 or 4 times as much plus their own legal fees and still lose. Derek stood up and said they were giving in to extortion. He said Robert was taking advantage of them and that they should stand their ground on principle. An older man near the front, someone who'd lived there since the beginning, stood up and turned to face Derek. He said that Derek had created this entire disaster with his ego and his demands. The rest of them shouldn't have to suffer for years because Derek didn't want to admit he'd made a massive mistake. The man said he was voting yes on the settlement, and he hoped everyone else with common sense would too. The vote passed, 42-8. Robert got the official notification 2 days later. The HOA had agreed to his terms. Patricia had already contacted a contractor, and was ready to start work as soon as Robert gave the okay. She asked if they could meet to sign the paperwork and discuss the timeline. They met at Robert's farm again. Patricia brought the contract, a check for his legal fees, and a formal letter of apology signed by all the current board members. The letter acknowledged that the HOA's previous president had destroyed Robert's private property without permission or cause, and they took full responsibility for making it right. Robert read the letter twice. It wasn't just legal language. It was a real apology. Patricia had written it herself, and you could tell. He signed the contract. The bridge construction would begin the following Monday. But Patricia had another question for Robert. She asked if he'd be willing to allow residents to use his road during construction, not for regular commuting since that would tear up the road, but for emergencies and essential trips, maybe a few cars at a time on a schedule, just so people weren't completely dependent on that logging trail. Robert thought about it. The construction would take about 3 months. 3 months of keeping everyone on that dangerous trail seemed excessive, especially after the ambulance incident. He agreed, but with conditions. Only emergency vehicles had unlimited access. Regular residents could use the road for essential trips like medical appointments or getting to work, but they had to call ahead and get approval. Maximum 5 cars per hour so his road wouldn't be destroyed. Patricia agreed immediately. She set up a simple scheduling system where residents could text a dedicated number, explain where they needed to go, and get a time slot. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. The day construction started, about a dozen residents came out to watch. Robert was there too, talking with the contractor about specifications. A few people thanked him. One woman brought him a pie. Another guy shook his hand and apologized for some of the nasty things that had been said in the neighborhood Facebook group. But not everyone was happy. Derek and his supporters were bitter about the whole thing. They saw Robert as someone who'd manipulated the situation to get a free bridge rebuild out of the neighborhood. The fact that Derek had literally demolished Robert's bridge didn't seem to matter to them. In their minds, Robert should have just let everyone keep using his road and worked something out later. Derek kept posting in the Facebook group, trying to rally support for some kind of action against Robert. He suggested filing complaints with the county about road access. He talked about getting a lawyer to review whether Robert was operating an illegal toll road by controlling access. His posts got increasingly desperate as fewer and fewer people engaged with them. Most residents just wanted the bridge done so they could get back to normal life. The construction phase had its own challenges. The contractor hit some unexpected issues with the ravine's soil stability and had to bring in additional support beams. That added 2 weeks to the timeline and another $12,000 to the cost. Patricia called Robert, worried that he'd see this as the HOA's problem, but Robert surprised her. He said if the soil needed extra support, then it needed extra support. He wanted the bridge built right, not built cheap. The contractor had explained to him why the upgrades were necessary, and Robert agreed with the reasoning. The HOA would have to cover the extra cost, but Robert told Patricia he'd talk to the contractor about keeping other costs down where possible. Patricia almost cried on the phone. She'd been dealing with Derek's hostility for so long that she'd forgotten what it was like to work with someone reasonable. As the bridge took shape, something interesting happened in the neighborhood. People started to realize how much they'd taken the original arrangement for granted. For 13 years, they'd had easy access to their homes because Robert had been willing to share his bridge and road. He could have said no from the very beginning. He could have demanded money, or an easement, or any number of things. But he hadn't. He'd just asked for help with maintenance and been a good neighbor. It was Derek who'd ruined that by treating the situation like a business deal that needed to be formalized and controlled. And it was Derek who'd decided that destroying someone else's property was an acceptable way to get what he wanted. A group of residents started a fund to give Robert a thank you gift once the bridge was done. They raised almost $4,000 and debated what to buy. Someone suggested a new truck. Someone else said they should offer to pave his driveway. In the end, they decided to ask Robert what he actually needed. When they approached him with the idea, Robert was genuinely touched. He said he didn't need anything fancy, but if they really wanted to help, there was a section of fencing on his property that needed replacing. It wasn't urgent, but it would save him a lot of work if someone else could handle it. The group immediately hired a fencing contractor and got it done. Meanwhile, Derek's situation was getting worse. Several residents had started looking into his actions as HOA president, and they didn't like what they found. The $30,000 he'd spent on demolishing the bridge without approval was just the start. He'd also spent $15,000 on his lawyer friend to draft that easement demand, and another $20,000 on a property survey that turned out to be completely wrong about the property lines. All of it had been spent without proper board approval or transparency. Patricia filed a formal complaint on behalf of the HOA, and a few residents were talking about pursuing personal legal action against Derek for mismanagement of funds and the resulting property value losses. Derek's wife was apparently furious with him. Neighbors reported hearing arguments through the windows. She'd warned him to drop the issue with Robert months ago, but Derek had been convinced he was right. Now they were facing potential lawsuits and were social pariahs in their own neighborhood. About 2 months into construction, Robert had an unexpected visitor. It was Derek's wife, Stephanie. She came alone and looked exhausted. She asked if they could talk. Robert invited her to sit on the porch. Stephanie didn't make excuses for her husband, which Robert appreciated. She said Derek had always been the type to turn everything into a fight, especially when he thought he was right about something. It had cost them friendships before, but never anything like this. She told Robert that she'd seen the original arrangement as perfectly fine. She told Derek to leave it alone. But once Derek got an idea in his head, he couldn't let it go. And now their marriage was falling apart over it, along with their finances and their reputation in the community. Robert didn't know what to say. He felt bad for Stephanie, but he also wasn't going to apologize for protecting his own property. Stephanie said she wasn't asking for an apology. She just wanted Robert to know that not everyone in that house had SPO. The bridge was set to open in 2 weeks when Derek made his final move. He filed a lawsuit against Robert and the HOA. The lawsuit claimed that Robert was operating an illegal private toll road by controlling access to Riverside Estates. It argued that because the neighborhood had relied on the bridge for 15 years, Robert couldn't suddenly restrict access without violating something called prescriptive easement rights. Derek also claimed the HOA board had acted improperly by agreeing to Robert's extortionate demands without exploring other legal options. Patricia called Robert as soon as she received the papers. She sounded tired. She'd thought they were finally done with this mess, and now Derek was dragging them back into it. The lawsuit named both Robert and the HOA as defendants, which meant they'd both need lawyers. And even if the lawsuit was completely baseless, it would still cost time and money to fight. Robert's lawyer reviewed the filing and was almost amused by how weak it was. The prescriptive easement claim was ridiculous because the HOA had been paying for access the entire time, which meant they acknowledged it wasn't a public right. You can't claim prescriptive rights to something you've been paying to use. As for the toll road accusation, Robert wasn't charging anyone anything. He'd simply restricted access to his private property after someone destroyed his bridge. The claim about the HOA board acting improperly was also shaky. Patricia had held proper votes, gotten board approval, and acted in the best interest of the community. The fact that Derek didn't like the outcome didn't make it improper. But here's what concerned Robert's lawyer. Even a weak lawsuit can be expensive to defend. Derek was clearly hoping that either Robert or the HOA would offer him some kind of settlement just to make the case go away. It was a spite lawsuit, plain and simple. Robert and Patricia met to discuss their options. They could fight the lawsuit separately, each paying their own legal fees, or they could work together, share legal costs, and present a united front. Patricia said the HOA board had already voted to stand with Robert on this. They knew Derek was the problem, not Robert, and they weren't going to reward his behavior. They decided to hire a single legal team to defend both of them and split the costs. Patricia also made it clear that if the HOA won, they'd be pursuing Derek personally for their legal fees and possibly for damages related to his previous actions as president. The lawsuit hit the local news. A reporter got hold of the story and ran with it because it had everything: neighborhood drama, property rights, a demolished bridge, and now a legal battle. The article was mostly factual, laying out the timeline of events and the current lawsuit, but the comments section online was a mess. People who didn't know any of the details were making assumptions. Some sided with Derek, saying that Robert was being selfish by controlling access to an entire neighborhood. Others sided with Robert, pointing out that Derek had literally destroyed his property. A few people suggested both sides were wrong and should just compromise. The story got picked up by a few other regional news outlets. One of them reached out to Robert for an interview. His lawyer advised against it while the lawsuit was pending, but Robert decided to do it anyway. He was tired of Derek's version of events being the only one out there. The interview was straightforward. Robert explained the history of the arrangement, Derek's demands for a permanent easement and the bridge demolition. He showed the reporter photos of the destroyed bridge and the property line markers proving it had been entirely on his land. He also explained his settlement terms and why he'd thought they were fair. The reporter asked Robert if he regretted not just giving Derek the easement he wanted. Robert said no. Giving away permanent rights to his property for nothing would have cost him hundreds of thousands in property value. And more importantly, it was his land. He had every right to say no to someone demanding permanent access to it. The article that came out was sympathetic to Robert. The headline was something like "Local Farmer's Bridge, Demolished After Refusing HOA Demands." It painted Derek as an aggressive HOA president who'd overstepped and Robert as a property owner defending his rights. The comment section on that article was mostly supportive of Robert. Derek didn't like that. He started doing his own interviews, trying to spin the narrative. He told one news outlet that Robert had been planning to extort the neighborhood for years, and that he'd acted to prevent it. When the reporter asked for evidence, Derek said it was common knowledge and obvious from Robert's behavior. The reporter printed Derek's comments, but also noted that he provided no documentation to support his claims, and that property records showed the bridge had been entirely on Robert's land. Derek's lawsuit wasn't helping his case. People could see the timeline. Robert had lived peacefully with the HOA for 13 years. Derek became president and immediately started demanding more. When Robert refused, Derek destroyed his bridge. And now Derek was suing because Robert wanted his bridge rebuilt. It didn't look good. Meanwhile, the new bridge was almost complete. The contractor did a final inspection and said they'd be ready for the official opening in 1 week. Patricia planned a small ceremony to mark the occasion. She invited Robert, the construction crew, and any residents who wanted to attend. She didn't invite Derek, but he showed up anyway. The ceremony was nice at first. Patricia gave a short speech thanking Robert for his patience and thanking the construction crew for their excellent work. Several residents spoke, sharing how difficult the past few months had been and how grateful they were to have normal access restored. A couple of kids cut a ribbon stretched across the bridge, and everyone clapped. That's when Derek started talking, loudly. He said this whole ceremony was a joke, that they were celebrating being forced to pay nearly $200,000 because one man had held them hostage. He said Robert should be ashamed of himself for profiting off the neighborhood's misfortune. Robert didn't respond. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, letting Derek rant. Patricia tried to cut Derek off, but he kept going. He said the lawsuit would prove that Robert had no right to block access, and when it was over, Robert would be the one paying. Finally, one of the older residents, the same man who'd confronted Derek at the HOA meeting, walked over and told Derek to leave. He said Derek had done enough damage and that nobody wanted to hear from him anymore. A few other people joined in, agreeing that Derek should go. Derek left, but not before shouting that they'd all regret taking Robert's side. After he was gone, the ceremony continued. People walked across the new bridge, testing it out and admiring the construction. Robert talked with the contractor about the specific improvements they'd made. Kids ran back and forth, excited to have a shortcut to the main road again. One woman approached Robert with tears in her eyes. She said she was the mother who'd gone into labor that night, the one whose baby was born in the ambulance on the logging trail. She thanked Robert for being reasonable about the settlement and for allowing emergency access during construction. She said if he hadn't, she didn't want to think about what might have happened. Robert told her he was just glad she and her baby were okay. She hugged him, which made Robert uncomfortable in that way that kind gestures from strangers always did. But he hugged her back. The lawsuit moved slowly, as lawsuits do. Derek's lawyer filed motions. Robert and Patricia's legal team filed responses. There were deadlines and extensions and all the usual legal procedures. Robert tried not to think about it too much. His lawyer kept saying the case was weak and would likely be dismissed, but until it actually was, it hung over everything. 3 months after the bridge reopened, the first major hearing happened. Derek's lawyer argued that Robert had violated the neighborhood's rights by restricting access to the bridge during the construction period. Robert's lawyer pointed out that there was no bridge during that time, and that Robert had actually been generous by allowing any access at all to a road that led to a construction site. The judge seemed skeptical of Derek's arguments. She asked his lawyer to provide any documentation showing that Robert had a legal obligation to provide access to private property. Derek's lawyer talked about community standards and reasonable expectations, but couldn't provide actual legal precedent. Robert's lawyer then presented evidence that Derek had admitted to demolishing the bridge without permission, that the bridge had been entirely on Robert's property, and that the HOA had already settled the matter by agreeing to rebuild it. He argued that Derek's lawsuit was retaliatory and frivolous. The judge said she'd review the arguments and issue a ruling within 30 days. Those 30 days felt long. Robert went about his normal life, working on his farm and occasionally crossing his new bridge to go into town. People in Riverside Estates had mostly returned to normal, too. The logging trail had gone back to being unused. Property values were recovering. Life was settling down, but the lawsuit was a cloud hanging over everything. If Derek somehow won, or even if the case dragged on for years, it would be exhausting and expensive. Robert wasn't worried about losing on the merits, but he was worried about the process itself becoming punishment. Patricia kept Robert updated on the mood in the neighborhood. Most people had moved on and were just happy to have their bridge back. But Derek's small group 6 months after the bridge reopened, life in Riverside Estates had returned to something close to normal. The new bridge was working perfectly, even better than the original in some ways. The contractor had built it to modern standards with better drainage and stronger supports. Robert joked that this bridge would probably outlast him. The informal agreement with the HOA was working smoothly. They paid their $6,000 annually in 2 installments, and Robert kept up with maintenance and inspections. Patricia had created a simple communication system where the HOA would notify Robert of any concerns, and he'd address them promptly. No drama, no demands, just neighbors working together. Derek and his wife sold their house at a loss and moved about 2 hours away. Robert heard through the grapevine that their marriage had survived barely, but that they'd needed a fresh start somewhere where nobody knew about the bridge disaster. The HOA had recovered about $30,000 from Derek through their lawsuit, which didn't cover everything he'd cost them, but it was something. The new residents who bought Derek's house were a young couple with 2 small kids. They introduced themselves to Robert one weekend, bringing over some cookies and thanking him for maintaining the bridge. They'd heard the whole story from neighbors and said they couldn't imagine what Derek had been thinking. Robert appreciated the gesture. He'd been worried that Derek's old house would be occupied by people who believed Derek's version of events. But these folks seemed reasonable. The story about the bridge had made its way around the county and even spread a bit online. Robert became a minor local celebrity for a few weeks. People would recognize him at the hardware store or the diner and want to talk about property rights and HOA overreach. Robert mostly just smiled and changed the subject. He'd never wanted to be famous for any of this. But something good came from the publicity. A few other people in similar situations reached out to Robert for advice. One guy had an HOA demanding access to his private well. Another woman had neighbors who wanted to run a power line across her property without compensation. Robert couldn't give legal advice, but he could share what he'd learned. Document everything. Know your property lines, stand firm on reasonable terms, and don't let people bully you into giving away your rights. Patricia turned out to be an excellent HOA president. She ran things transparently, got board approval for major decisions, and actually listened to residents' concerns. The neighborhood appreciated having someone competent in charge after the Derek disaster. She was re-elected twice with overwhelming support. About a year after everything settled, Patricia approached Robert with an idea. The HOA wanted to do something permanent to acknowledge what had happened and to memorialize the lesson they'd all learned. She suggested a small plaque on the bridge, something simple that explained the history. Robert wasn't sure at first. He didn't need a monument to his troubles. But Patricia explained that it wasn't really about Robert. It was about reminding future residents and future HOA boards that property rights matter, that informal agreements work when people are reasonable, and that trying to take what isn't yours can backfire spectacularly. Robert agreed. The plaque was small and tasteful, mounted on a post at the bridge entrance. It read, "This bridge stands on private property belonging to the adjacent farm. For decades it has been shared between neighbors through mutual respect and cooperation. May this spirit of good faith continue for generations to come." No mention of Derek, no mention of the demolition or lawsuit, just a reminder of how things should work. The county newspaper did a follow-up story a year and a half after the bridge reopened. The reporter interviewed several Riverside Estates residents about how things had changed. Most people said they'd learned to appreciate what they had and not take it for granted. A few admitted they'd been too quick to judge Robert during the crisis without knowing all the facts. One resident said something that stuck with Robert. He said that the whole experience had taught him that just because something works informally doesn't mean you should try to formalize it. Sometimes trying to lock things down legally actually destroys the goodwill that made the arrangement work in the first place. That was exactly what had happened with Derek. The old agreement worked because both sides chose to make it work. Derek's attempt to force a legal easement had destroyed that goodwill and cost everyone far more than if he'd just left things alone. Robert was interviewed for the article too. The reporter asked if he'd do anything differently if he could go back. Robert thought about it and said no. He'd been reasonable at every step. He'd agreed to the original informal arrangement, refused the one-sided easement demand, insisted on fair compensation after his property was destroyed, and allowed access during construction when he didn't have to. The reporter asked if Robert regretted not just giving Derek the easement to avoid all the trouble. Robert said that would have been rewarding bad behavior. Derek had demanded something Robert wasn't obligated to give, then destroyed Robert's property when he didn't get his way. Giving in to that would have just taught Derek that bullying works. "Sometimes standing up for yourself is inconvenient and expensive," Robert said, "but so is being a doormat. I chose the inconvenience that came with keeping my self-respect and my property rights." The article quoted several legal experts who said Robert's case was a textbook example of how to handle property disputes. One lawyer said that property owners often give in to unreasonable demands from neighbors, HOAs, or developers because fighting back seems too hard. But Robert had shown that standing firm, documenting everything, and insisting on fair terms could actually work out. Patricia was quoted too. She said the experience had changed how she thought about HOA governance. She'd learned that the HOA's job wasn't to maximize what they could get from people, but to maintain good relationships with everyone the neighborhood interacted with. The $6,000 a year they paid Robert for bridge access was a bargain compared to what they'd spent on the demolition, reconstruction, and lawsuits. Life continued peacefully for several years. Robert eventually semi-retired completely from farming, leasing most of his land to a young farmer who was just starting out. But he kept the property around the bridge, and he kept his agreement with the HOA. It had become part of his routine, checking the bridge every few months, coordinating with Patricia on any maintenance needs. Robert and Patricia became genuine friends over the years. She'd invite him to neighborhood events, and he'd actually go to some of them. He wasn't a social butterfly, but it was nice to be on good terms with his neighbors. Some of the kids in the neighborhood knew him as the bridge guy, which made him laugh. One of those kids, a teenager named Kyle, did a school project about the bridge dispute. He interviewed Robert, Patricia, and several other residents. His project won an award at the regional level. The thesis was about how conflict resolution works better through good faith negotiation than through force or litigation. Kyle's teacher said it was one of the most mature projects she'd seen from a high school student. Robert went to Kyle's presentation and was impressed. The kid had really understood what happened and why. He'd identified the exact moment things went wrong, which was when Derek stopped treating Robert like a neighbor and started treating him like an obstacle to be overcome. About 5 years after the bridge reopened, Robert got a letter in the mail that surprised him. It was from Derek. The letter was short and handwritten. Derek apologized for everything he'd done. He said he'd spent years thinking about the situation and had come to realize that his ego and need for control had destroyed what was actually a good arrangement. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted Robert to know that he'd been wrong and he was sorry. Robert read the letter twice. He didn't respond right away. He showed it to Patricia, who was surprised that Derek had actually apologized. She said that 5 years of reflection had apparently taught him something. After thinking about it for a week, Robert wrote back. He kept it brief. He said he appreciated the apology and that he hoped Derek had found peace wherever he'd moved to. He didn't say he forgave Derek because he wasn't sure he did, but he acknowledged the apology. Sometimes that's enough. Patricia told Robert that she'd also received an apology letter from Derek, and so had several other members of the old HOA board. Derek seemed to be making amends as part of some personal journey he was on. Patricia said she'd responded similarly to Robert, acknowledging the apology without necessarily granting complete forgiveness. The bridge continued to serve both Robert's property and Riverside Estates without incident. The annual maintenance routine became so predictable that it barely required any discussion. The HOA would send their check, Robert would confirm receipt, and they'd coordinate on the twice-yearly inspections. Easy. Property values in Riverside Estates fully recovered and then exceeded what they'd been before the bridge demolition. The neighborhood's reputation had actually improved because the story demonstrated that the residents in HOA could handle a crisis reasonably. Prospective buyers saw the functional relationship between the neighborhood and Robert as a positive thing. Robert occasionally got calls from reporters or researchers who wanted to use his story as a case study.